I'm Dwayne Schultes. Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. Today I'm very pleased to be joined by VT's grumpy old men, Dr. Joe Hamming, VT's U.S. Business Director and a card-carrying neuroscientist. Joe, how you doing?
Great, Dwayne. Thanks. Good to see you guys this afternoon.
And I'm also joined by Dr. Harry Bowen, VT's consulting economist and a professional purveyor of common sense. How are you, Dr. Bowen?
Doing very well. Thank you, Dwayne. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
How's your grumpy level today, Harry?
I'm getting grumpier by the second.
Harry loves being grumpy on podcasts. The Trump administration has an agreement in hand with Pfizer for most favored nations drug pricing in Medicaid. What is most favored nations drug pricing? Harry, I'm going to start with you. What is most favored nations?
Most favored nation drug pricing is to pick out a country within a certain distance from the U.S. GDP, and then to look at the price that is being charged for a particular drug or an average basket of drugs, and then to say that our prices in the United States are much greater than in most favored nation that we've picked, and we need to lower our drug prices to that level, or alternatively have the foreign most favored nation raise their drug prices to our level. So basically we're trying to level the field with regard to the price that's being charged to U.S. consumers in the U.S. market.
So Joe, given what we've just heard from Harry, if we go back to, say, the year 2000, 2004, somewhere in there where the Medicare Part D prescription drug benefit was passed, the bell cow for expensive drugs was Lipitor, which was a Pfizer product. Now, what's the history of that product, and how was pricing when you folks grabbed up Lipitor from Warner Lambert when you made that acquisition?
Well, in the early 2000s, we were fighting the perception of this horrifically expensive medicine, Lipitor, which was, in the United States, was $600 to $800 a year. By the standards today, that seems like a very, very low price. Prices throughout Europe and the rest of the world were very comparable at that point. But what has happened since is now that Lipitor and the other statins are off patent, the price has dropped to essentially free. It's pennies per pill. So the comparison at the time was very much even with the US and the rest of the world. But that ushered in a period of incredible innovation in many products and a lot of biologic products, which are very expensive. The cost of goods is very high. It's an apples and oranges comparison when you think of the 2000s, early 2000s to today, because again, we didn't have those incredibly expensive products like we do today.
So Harry, we've just released 2 most favored nation studies. The most recent was focused on Medicare. If you look at those impacts of a theoretical most favored nation rollout where we price on the lowest country in the basket, what are the impacts of that? Top line, what do we see is happening?
So we looked at the top 50 drugs in Medicare, B, D. We also went into Medicaid. The bottom line was that was a loss of a little over 2 million jobs. That represents about 40% of the current U.S. jobs in the biopharmaceutical industry. Of course, the knock-on effect of that is the government loses tax revenue. So we also calculated that over a 10-year period from 25 to 34, that we'd lose about $600 billion in federal tax revenue and about $450 billion in state tax. And if you look at that as a fraction of GDP, we calculated under the best guess idea of what price reductions would be that we'd get a loss of about 1.8% of U.S. GDP, which is $27 trillion, under a less stringent price reduction, which basically is about half. These are not small numbers.
No.
They are huge numbers.
You know, Steve Usden at BioCentury just wrote a great article about this, highlighting that Pfizer has negotiated in Medicaid, not Medicare, So we'd heard initially this summer that it was going to be Medicaid. Then the Trump administration came out and said it's going to be Medicare. And then it turns out the deal is, in fact, Medicaid. That actually drops the impacts by about a little less than half. It's about roughly 1 million jobs and 775,000 jobs, about $1 trillion of impact. I mean, again, devastating, really bad. Is this going to have a uniform impact? Pfizer said, hey, we're just going to do Medicaid. How does this work compared to some of the other firms out there?
None of these huge policy prescriptions, if you will, are even across the board. They all have different impacts depending on the company's size, its portfolio, whether it has a very heavy Medicaid population, like some that we've spoken about recently. It is not an even impact across the various biopharmaceutical companies. It's quite the opposite, actually.
So if we look at, say, a company like Vertex that deals mostly in cystic fibrosis, there's a lot of poor kids that have cystic fibrosis. One would think that Vertex would be over-indexed in this and be probably quite impacted.
One would think. We haven't run all those particular numbers, of course, but Vertex isn't alone. There are going to be many, many, many companies that cater to these populations that are going to be hit very hard if this were to be implemented across the board.
Duchenne muscular dystrophy,
right.
That's another one.
Right.
Again, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. This is something where you need a treatment. It's an orphan drug. It's going to be expensive, and a lot of that is going to be in Medicaid.
Right.
We're celebrating something here without really thinking of the third and fourth level impacts. Given past history and what we've seen when things get implemented at the federal level, I mean, I've been assured by Woodrow Wilson that federal income tax is temporary until World War I is over. So I'm waiting for that to be rescinded.
I didn't know you knew him.
Personally, well, I know him every year when I pay my taxes, Joe, definitely. Harry, the question is, do we honestly think this is going to stay in Medicaid, or does this dial get twisted?
These huge sweeping ideas in terms of what they're trying to do, I just think that we're going about constructing a whole potential disaster infrastructure around the idea of lowering drug prices, price controls, let's call them what they are. There's such a scope to screw things up.
Is that a technical economic term?
That is. It's called you're effed. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good example of that. A lot of this is they don't really know what to do. They'd really like to do something because politically that's what they would like to do. But I think they also know that they're really going to screw things up. Somebody is thinking hopefully beyond step one and saying, this might look good on paper today, but 3 months down the road, when those insurance premiums go through the roof, which is now what we're seeing in terms of shutdowns and all that, and we had predicted that in terms of earlier work. I mean, there are just these god-awful unintended consequences that come out of that nobody is going to be happy. The American public is not going to be happy when their insurance premiums quadruple.
Which we're starting to see.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 20% to 36%, depending on where you're at right now. Let's go scorched earth on this. Let's say somebody now that we've put in MFN. The problem is this mechanism doesn't disappear. Let's say the Trump administration, obviously they dialed this back and they said, okay, we're going into Medicaid. Let's say Europe says, no, we're not going to do this. And let's say the prices disperse and go down and we have this 80% price dispersion. What happens if we start pushing prices down 60, 70% in the U.S.?
The received wisdom is that the biopharmaceutical industry is so over profitable and it just rakes in money that they can take whatever is dished out. We have already seen over the last couple of years significant changes in the way that the industry is looking at early investments, for instance. There's nothing more popular to the average American than hearing that drug prices are going to be slashed. But with that popular message of let's slash prices, let's make it fair across the board, that is throughout the world, what is to stop this from creeping into the Medicare market and other markets? I don't think there's anything to stop that. And I'd like to refer to the excellent conversation that you had with John Murphy from Association for Accessible Medicines. He made a really wonderful point. John's point was that this administration is very, very interested in learning about the market and is trying to figure it out. I was very pleased to hear him say that the administration is willing to listen and willing to learn. But what we need to do as an industry is to continue to show what the consequences will be if these types of policy prescriptions continue to creep into other existing markets. I don't think anybody's trying to break the system, but it's very close to being broken if there isn't some careful analysis of what we can expect in the future.
If we look at some of the reactions, say what's been going on in Europe, for example, this is a press release dated May 21st, 2025 from the European Commission. I'm just going to read the headline here. European Commission welcomes political agreement on compulsory licensing to enhance EU crisis resilience. Let's unwind that Orwellian speak here a little bit. What does this mean? Compulsory licensing used to be a member state competence, so that would have to be put in the 27 member states. The EU has just put together a reconciled package that allows a one-stop shop to do a compulsory license EU-wide. Now, why would they do that right now, Harry? Why would the EU be wanting to be focused on being able to make it really easy to compulsory license, which means, i.e., we're going to take your patent and then give it to someone else? Why would that happen?
Well, if the U.S. demands that the drug prices in Europe go up and the Europeans balk at that, they can always compulsory license.
If the company doesn't utilize their patents.
If the company doesn't utilize its patents, it can be compulsory license. This is a disaster for the companies. I think car prices are too expensive.
Yeah.
Why don't we get car prices down? Those BMWs and Mercedes are a lot cheaper in Europe than they are over here. And I think we should have those. Just a little levity there, but hopefully showing the idiocy of all this.
There was just an announcement that one of our clients is going to make sure, and it was a very splashy announcement about 3 weeks ago, that the drug price that they're putting here in the U.S. is the same price that they're rolling out in the U.K. And as I pointed out, that's great. You can announce a price in the U.K. Now, are you going to get that price with the NHS? Probably not.
When you think about just the example of Merck a little over a month ago making that big decision, the huge withdrawal from the U.K., this is not because things are great. This is because there's a lack of appreciation and understanding of what it takes to develop medicines, and they're going to move to the United States. My fear is we have the opportunity here in the United States to attract an enormous amount of investment. At the very time that we are winning, we're ready to fritter that away. I don't get it. We could very easily lose our edge. We're in very serious danger of fumbling the future here.
If you go back 2018, Chinese-based companies were doing about 100 clinical trials. If you look at this year, it's gone up one full order of magnitude. There are 1,000 trials in 2025 being filed with the FDA. These are Chinese-run trials, Chinese companies filing in the FDA. They've now gone past Europe in the league table. They're actually producing more clinical research than European companies, and at current trend, they're going to eclipse the United States by 2028, according to our projections.
China is going to swamp us if we're not careful. We're doing exactly the wrong thing.
Well, I would say, competition is healthy.
Sure.
In that sense, we welcome that competition, let's say, from China. The problem is we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And these policies are just moving us closer to shooting ourselves in the leg and finally in the rear end and pretty soon in the head. And that's really the problem. We're killing ourselves. We still are competitive at the moment, but we're slowly slipping down that very steep slope. It's very disconcerting.
If you go back and look at the data on biotech creation, this is just 5 years ago, 2020, 2019, you see that Europe was producing 40%, US was producing 60% of biotechs. Now, that's 5 years ago. You look at that now, it's 20% on either end has completely disappeared, and that's just in 5 years. My point is this goes away pretty darn fast. There was a story we saw in Stat that Peter Kolchinsky, the very famous venture capitalist that we've collaborated with and worked with a bit, Peter had shut down one of his venture funds and relocated it to China. Picking up on Most Favored Nations, this is not the first time this has occurred. The Trump administration had put in something under an executive order under Medicare Part D as a demonstration project. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a lawsuit here. I don't think the companies are going to try the same legal approach that they did last time. Do you think they're just going to go in and say, okay, we're going to negotiate individual by individual company?
The honest answer is I don't know. It seems as though this is becoming a sort of a one-off situation. That is the way that the Trump administration is happy to do things. Companies are making lots of interesting one-off decisions to increase their manufacturing capacity in the United States, to avoid tariffs, for instance. I don't see the same appetite for that kind of action at this point.
So we've got pricing pressure being put on Medicaid. We've got tariffs being threatened somewhere between 15 and 100%. We've got a request to onshore manufacturing, but we also want drug prices lower. Harry, does all this work? Can we do all that?
Yes and no.
You economist, you.
All these things, it creates a kind of confusion. Trump is following the divide and conquer rule. So, as you mentioned, he's negotiating individually with the drug companies, doesn't want to talk to the pharma organization that represents collectively drug companies. And a lot of that just has to do with the idea of bargaining power and negotiation. If you go for an individual company, the bargaining power of an individual company is less than a group of companies. So if they all collectively said, okay, we will do this, if not that, then they're just a bigger element. So they have more bargaining power in that sense. You want to try to minimize the amount of leverage that the other party has. That just gives you more leverage. It may also be partly a political kind of thing. If they can get a major drug company to announce that they're doing something, okay, we've done that. Now let's move on to all this other stuff that we're trying to do. This all comes in small waves. They're important, but they're small waves. It's not like a huge tsunami legislation that's coming in. Trump tends to send off these bottle rockets every now and then. Bottle rocket goes off, here's this big splashy thing, and then a week later you don't really hear much about it anymore. So a lot of it is just kind of wait and see. It's kind of like been with the tariffs. 100% tariffs on China, and then, okay, now we negotiate it to this, and it's just part of a strategy. But certainly in a political sense, I don't think it's the usual game.
Yeah, but we had 3.8% GDP growth last quarter, which puts us one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. Yet hiring is scaloric. There's nothing there.
A lot of this is supply driven, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we are losing a lot of the labor force. Demand seems to be sufficient to be absorbing a reduced labor force. Everybody is a bit confused by this, to tell you the truth.
Pharma and bio were always the 500-pound gorillas on the block as far as D.C. lobbying. It's kind of amazing that we're now in a situation where they've been blocked out of the MFN negotiation. Did you ever kind of see this? Would this have ever happened?
I can't imagine it ever happening, but here we are. It goes to the art of the deal. It's a divide and conquer strategy. Why negotiate with a trade organization if you can go to individual CEOs and get a deal? Then it allows you to go to the next company and the next company, and with the expectations that things fall into place.
If you were still running a policy shop for a major firm, what would you do now? Take retirement?
Yes. We've both talked to people who do have those responsibilities. And what do they tell us? We're doing the best we can. We don't know what's coming next because it's kind of the Wild West.
How much of this is just the complete erosion of public opinion of the industry due to what happened during COVID?
I think it had a lot to do with it. It raised a lot of alarm bells. We were looking at eye-popping numbers that were guaranteed to the industry for the vaccine alone. It was a windfall beyond anybody's imagination. That didn't help. When you look at the kind of investment that companies like Pfizer made, before they knew they were going to get an approval, they were putting billions of dollars into making their vaccine. That was applauded in a big way at the time. As far as the trust in science thing is concerned, there's been an enormous erosion in the public eye because of what happened. But there is one thing that I remember sitting around in March of 2020, as we all did, and I was watching on television, And I was hearing pundits and TV personalities telling the world that if you get a vaccine, you're not going to get sick and it stops with you. Anyone who knows anything about vaccines knows that that's not the way they work. The fact that we, out of fear, those who knew best and knew that that was a fallacy, did not speak up simply because they thought that they would dissuade people from going to get the vaccine. And that is not the way to operate. Those kind of behaviors have landed us where we are.
I agree with you 100%, but I think it might be better to say that it's not a lack of trust in science, but rather a lack of trust in scientists. It was really just this political dynamic that really happened.
You know, Harry, you and I worked on that article in STAT. We had built a pretty effective model that could predict mortality based on incidence rates in COVID. And we kept it up to date, and this was just kind of our own hobby. When Omicron hit, you and I ran the statistics and say, hey, wait a minute, this model's broken down, and we're not seeing an increase in mortality. Wow. Published that only 2 weeks after Omicron hit. I think Omicron hit right around Thanksgiving, and the numbers were just going through the roof. And we published this article, and I remember I got a note from STAT. They had millions of downloads in that article. And I'd still at that time had my business office phone number. I was getting death threats over Christmas for that article. People were literally calling me, threatening my life, because I had the temerity to say that Omicron was not going to be as highly fatal as other versions of COVID-19. You're calling me because I have the audacity to say that fewer people are going to die. Ergo, you want more people to die? It struck me that the reason why they did was because they liked having the power and they liked having the moral authority. It was just a very twisted mentality. And unfortunately, I think the industry's been dragged into this.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So let's have some predictions. What else is going to happen now? It's like everything in the kitchen sink is getting thrown at the industry. I mean, where else are we going to go now?
Oh boy, the slope is slippery. I think that we're going to see more companies follow suit from Trump RX, the way that Pfizer has decided to slash prices for Medicaid patients. I predict that you won't see companies that have large portfolios in Medicaid slashing prices. If this starts to look promising to the administration, I don't see any way that you can stop the camel from getting under the tent and moving to Medicare. I don't see how that won't come to pass at some point. The other thing I want to also point out, the John Murphy podcast, it's very instructional to everybody who's interested in healthcare policy to really understand the race to the bottom in generic medicines, which make up 90% of prescriptions today. John lays that out with you so beautifully, Dwayne. We have a real problem on our hands with the loss of capacity to manufacture, a market that is failing and is creating all kinds of pressures on companies to make future investments. It's really, across the board, a dangerous time. I don't see the cavalry coming over the very near term, and that is a little frightening.
I'd also like to recommend the Patrick Kelly podcast as well, because he's in the distribution side. You know, he has to take these prices that are thrown out, and his perspective on this was chilling.
Yes, absolutely chilling.
Harry, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, this is Trump, right? So we don't really know how it's going to play out. I think tariffs are, half just a negotiating tool. There's some revenue that comes in from it, et cetera.
But honestly, that revenue is a cost, right?
Yeah. I mean, it costs certainly for the U.S. consumer.
Sure.
I really think that tariffs are more of a negotiating tactic, and they can create problems. I mean, you could impose tariffs on medicines coming into the United States. You could impose export taxes on medicines leaving the United States. That would tend to lower drug prices within the U.S. market. So you could get involved.
Don't give him any ideas, Harry.
Well, you could get involved in all kinds of things. I have no clue where he's going to go with these things. The notion that we're being ripped off by foreign governments in terms of having lower drug prices is sort of stupid. From the standpoint of an individual company, why do they go into these markets and accept these lower prices? Well, these are peripheral markets for them.
But Europe didn't used to be, I guess. That's
Well,
the point.
it's interesting because I hadn't thought about the timing of the Part D
Yes.
Medicare. Maybe it has something to do with when government starts paying for things,
Right.
everybody comes to the trough.
Yeah.
It may be that the policies that are followed in the context of Medicare Part D actually tended to exacerbate this whole problem.
When the industry decided that it was going to sell their medicines in quote unquote secondary markets or markets that were equal to the United States, they didn't start at the level that they are today. They started at a small discount because it made sense. The pills are pressed, packaged, and shipped off. And you can take 10% less or 15% less. And that was the idea from the beginning. It's one of those insidious things. You just don't know when you make those sorts of decisions, you don't know where it's going to head. And that's what's happened. The industry isn't in a position often to withhold medicines because a company only wants to pay 50% or 25% of what the price is in the United States. They find themselves between a rock and a hard place. That is the problem with decision making based on what looks good today.
Well, it comes down to the fact that Europe has some fairly serious economic issues and demographic issues.
Exactly.
A substantial part, 20% of the population is going to be over 80 years old here pretty quick in several European countries. 2014, before Angela Merkel opened up the border of Germany, you had worse age replacement levels than Japan in Germany. Yep. It was like 1.4, 1.3, the lowest in the OECD. Germany has a 5% decrease in manufacturing last quarter. Some very, very scary macroeconomic numbers coming out of Europe right now. And the healthcare is seen as a cost. And as the industry has left Europe, or there's less and less of it being profitable in Europe, the political impact of cutting it, it's like, hey, the Americans are paying for it. And so the downside for a politician for impacting this stuff is negligible. And the reality is, if a company were to pull their drug out of Europe, and a politician would compulsory license it and say, well, we're going to get this for free. One, it's cheaper than they would have been even under an MFN. And two, they will never lose another vote ever in Europe. I mean, are you kidding? Beating up the industry? If you think it's bad here, they will win that election forever and a day. It's cynical as hell, but it's just the way it is. Anything positive?
Not really. I mean, it reminded me, it just scares me about compulsory licensing would come to the United States. Because if we're negotiating and they're refusing to lower the drug prices, the government could just say, well, we're going to compulsory license it.
But it would need to qualify as a medical emergency. It would need to be an emergency under the WTO rules. Yeah. So what would trigger that?
Oh, well, Trump seems to find emergencies everywhere. So, this is an economic emergency.
This goes to COVID. This exactly goes to COVID. This was the playbook that was ran in COVID.
I should shut up because I don't want to give people
You're giving ideas, Harry.
No, we don't want to do that.
To your point, these are ideas that seem far-fetched that aren't necessarily far-fetched. That's the issue.
And they would be quite popular.
Yes. So, Dwayne, you asked about, is there anything positive? I think there is, but it's going to take a lot of work on the part of industry and their trade organizations. And drugs are only seen as a cost in the system. Never, ever does anyone stand up and say, wait a second, drugs keep people alive longer. That creates costs, obviously, but it keeps people out of the hospital. And when you think about the 90% of prescriptions that are generic, that is something that the industry has to hammer at over and over and over again to show what kind of cost savings there are because of innovative new products.
Well, we've seen that with hepatitis C.
Yes, we certainly have.
Those drugs saved well over 100,000 euros per patient savings. When you looked at the annuitized risk of requiring a liver transplant, we know it.
Yep.
And there are innumerable cases where I can point that out. It's a good point. I hope that cooler heads prevail and logic comes in. But with that, gentlemen, always a pleasure speaking to you.
Likewise.
I will say this. We are living in interesting times, Harry. Dr. Hamming, Joe, always great to see you, my friend.
Gentlemen, have a good day.
Harry, pleasure.
Take care. Thank you. Thank you, Dwayne.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Stay grumpy.
Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation LLC, copyright 2025.